And they both lived happily ever after.
Precarious.
My most adored queen, where did you send her?
To a place where there are no happily ever afters.
Let's take a step back into 2007. Disney's renaissance had been over for a few years now, and the studio was in this weird, experimental phase as they moved away from 2D animation. One of their more successful experiments was Enchanted, a live-action fairy tale about a so-called Disney princess who gets stuck in the least magical world of all. Ours. If you thought something like, hey, I remember that movie, then you wouldn't be the only one. It's a movie you don't really see talked about nowadays. Which is weird, because Enchanted does have a lot going for it. This movie is an homage to Disney classics of old, while at the same time being a fresh, modern take on those stories. And it's more than just a neat premise. Unlike some of Disney's other live-action outings, Enchanted isn't a guilty pleasure or so bad it's good. It's pretty good. And don't take my word for it, Enchanted released a strong critical reception, and it had a respectable box office run to boot. So, it begs the question, what happened? From both a critical and commercial standpoint, this movie did really well. It's strange that besides Amy Adams' breakout, Enchanted has all but vanished from the public consciousness. And it's even stranger that it took over a decade for the sequel to finally get off the ground. Surely there must be a reason why it's fallen by the wayside over time, especially since some of its peers are still well known today.
Are you trying to steal that?
Enchanted is unique in that at first glance, it doesn't have any obvious problems that drag it down. But while it may not have obvious problems, I think a lot of the smaller issues with this film really add up. And some of those issues may help in getting to the bottom of this mystery. So without further ado, let's dive into this retrospective and investigation of Disney's forgotten classic. Enchanted's first act can be split into two halves, the first of which takes place in the magical land of Andalasia. Besides being a gorgeous display of traditional animation, this segment is a cute prologue that captures the nostalgia of Disney's Silver Age. The prologue is basically a speedrun that goes through typical Disney story beats. And like the story being told, all the characters are designed to invoke those classic Disney tropes. Our leading lady Giselle is more or less a textbook definition of a fairy tale princess.
Presenting my one true love, my prince, my dream come true.
Edward fills the role of the charming prince, while Queen Nerissa and her lackey Nathaniel serve as our main villains. But while it's literally sunshine and roses for Giselle and Edward, the queen realizes that their marriage means she no longer has a right to the throne. So on Giselle's wedding day, she hatches a plan to get rid of her, setting the stage for the rest of the film. Enchanted is what happens when you pluck an actual fairy tale princess and toss her into the real world. Or specifically, New York City. As you'd expect from someone who spends their days singing in a magical forest, Giselle doesn't have the easiest time adjusting.
Oh, where are you going?
And while she's learning about the ins and outs of the Big Apple, we pivot to this film's real Prince Charming. Divorce lawyer Robert, a single father who's about to propose to a Disney princess of his own. And like everyone who's lived in a city at some point, his normal routine gets thrown for a loop when he bumps into an erratic homeless person on his way home. And luckily for him, this one isn't as crazy.
I've been wandering very far and long tonight, and I'm afraid nobody's been very nice to me.
Yeah, well, welcome to New York.
Thank you.
Giselle and Robert's first meeting sets the stage for the dynamic that ties this film together. On one side, you have the so-called Disney princess who believes in true love and happily ever afters. And on the other end, the cold, jaded lawyer who scoffs at true love and romance. It's a simple, if not predictable formula, but a fun one nonetheless.
What are you looking at?
She's beautiful.
This is a statue.
A majority of Enchanted revolves around Giselle being a ray of sunshine, while Robert plays the straight man to her weirdness. And Giselle's weirdness isn't always cute.
It's nice to meet you.
It's nice to meet you too.
Harley Quinn energy aside, the second act is where Enchanted truly shines. This is when the film takes the fantastical elements of its predecessors, but adds a splash of reality to it, breathing new life into these familiar cliches. The best example of this is with Enchanted's third musical number, That's How You Know. Besides being a fantastic song on its own, it's the same kind of number that wouldn't be out of place in an older Disney movie. But since it takes place in our world, it plays out like this full-scale, theatrical production, with all the style and pageantry you'd see on Broadway. And while the spectacles are the best example of fantasy and reality coming together, we can see both worlds converge in the more subdued character interactions. Shortly after the musical number, Robert opens up to Giselle about how his divorce left him heartbroken for many years. And being a fairy tale princess, Giselle has no idea how to process something like a marriage that didn't work out.
She left.
I'm so sorry for you both.
It's okay.
And there's a similar interaction a few scenes later, when Giselle starts arguing with Robert over his views on romance. As they both double down on their beliefs, Giselle gets so fed up that she experiences anger for the first time in her life. And like before, she's not sure how to process it.
You make me so angry! I'm angry.
These aren't the sort of things you normally see explored in a fairy tale, let alone a Disney fairy tale. And it's pretty cool to watch how a princess would react to more grounded, real-world dilemmas. But while Enchanted is normally good at balancing fantasy and reality, the third act is when you can see the film struggle to find that balance. Enchanted's final act can be split into two halves, the first of which revolves around the King and Queen's ball. And for a finale, it's a really great idea. Of all the Disney fairy tale tropes to use, a ballroom sequence works beautifully as a finale for this kind of movie. But while it's a great idea, it doesn't last very long. Because Peter Pettigrew couldn't finish the job, the Queen arrives at the party to kill Giselle herself. So she gives it one last shot, and it fails. Because you know, true love's kiss and all that jazz. So the Queen resorts to plan B. If there's one glaring weak point with Enchanted, it's this. Enchanted pulls an MCU and turns it into a dumb CGI battle for its climax. Although Enchanted did come out first, so maybe it's more accurate to say that the MCU pulled an Enchanted. But semantics aside, it's lame. Like all the weaker Marvel climaxes, it suffers from being so disconnected from the main conflict of the film. Enchanted already had a fitting finale with the King and Queen's ball, and it really wasn't necessary to add a dragon just because Sleeping Beauty did it first. And did it better for that matter. And to top it off, the dragon sequence isn't even that fun to watch. There's a brief moment where it looks like Enchanted is gonna go for a really cool twist on classic fairy tales, where the princess of the story gets to take up a sword and fight the dragon. Except the real final battle is nowhere near as exciting. It's not really a battle at all. Giselle gets to the building, saves Robert, and the dragon just sort of loses its grip.
Well, that was a freebie.
Anyways, after the dragon's demise, Giselle and Robert share a moment, and the film wraps up with a montage of everyone's happily ever after. While the final act isn't the best, it's not enough to bring down the whole film. Enchanted is a charming rendition on stories we know and love. And if you're a fan of fairy tales, Disney musicals, or romantic comedies, there's something in this movie that speaks to you. But if you've watched the film, you might have noticed there's a lot I glossed over. And that's because a lot of Enchanted's talking points fall into the same umbrellas. As someone who really likes Enchanted, I do think the smaller issues with this movie add up over time. And while they aren't as in your face as the third act, sometimes the devil is in the little details. Enchanted's music is just pretty good. You might be thinking, hey, that doesn't sound like a bad thing at all. And you're right, it's not. The composers behind Enchanted are none other than Alan Menken and Stephen Schwartz. If those names don't ring any bells, their music definitely will. Their combined resumes could make up a list as long as my arm, and it includes everything from Beauty and the Beast, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, and Wicked, just to give you a very quick snapshot. As you'd expect from renowned composers, they did a really good job in all the songs in Enchanted. And I think that's part of the problem. Disney may drop the ball in a lot of things, but music is rarely one of them. Enchanted just so happens to be a movie with pretty good songs, with many of its peers have incredible songs. So from that perspective, you can see how pretty good doesn't sound good enough. There are a total of 5 songs in Enchanted, with a few more that were either planned or cut from the final release. The first of which is True Love's Kiss, which doubles as Giselle's I Want song. It's an intentional homage to songs like I'm Wishing, and A Dream is a Wish Your Heart Makes, which are simple, expressive numbers about true love and happily ever afters. And you could say similar things about the next song, Happy Working Song, which is an homage to songs like Whistle While You Work and A Spoonful of Sugar. True Love's Kiss and Happy Working Song are good songs, but I personally don't think they're as catchy or as memorable as the songs they pay homage to. But they're really good homages, and it's a compliment to even be in the same ballpark as the classics in the first place. I already talked a little about the next number, That's How You Know, so this will be quick. Besides being one of the film's high points, it's far and away the best song in Enchanted. It's also the first to move away from the more overt Disney homages and evolve into something more its own. And if there's one thing I really like about Enchanted's music, it's how the music evolves with the film. The first two songs are reminiscent of classical Disney songs, while That's How You Know incorporates more modern elements into its composition. And the final two songs in the film are modern pop ballads, echoing the gradual shift from fantasy to reality. The penultimate song is the ballad So Close, sung by John McClellan during the ballroom scene. And the final song is Ever Ever After, sung by Carrie Underwood during the ending sequence. So Close and Ever Ever After aren't bad songs by any means, but they are kind of forgettable. Hell, I totally forgot they were even in the movie to begin with. So for Enchanted, you have 2 good songs, 1 really good song, and 2 okay songs. And when music is one of your film's main draws, 3 out of 5 isn't the best track record. Now, this isn't to say every musical has a perfect soundtrack. Even the best ones have a weak link or two. But, and I say this as someone who really loves this movie, even Enchanted's best song doesn't come close to reaching the heights of other musicals, Disney or otherwise. Great music has an indescribable quality to it. It seeps into your mind and stays with you for years at a time. The power of great music is so strong, it can elevate something that would otherwise be very ordinary. Frozen is perhaps the best example of this when it comes to Disney, but if you want some extreme examples, you can look at The Greatest Showman, the prequel trilogy, or Kingdom Hearts. The music doesn't even need to be that good, but it should be catchy, rhythmic, and most of all, memorable. It needs that spark, that je ne sais quoi that we can feel the moment we replay the song in our heads. Every successful musical has that song or melody that we can hear the moment we think about it. I've been using other movies and musicals as on-screen examples, and I bet you can hum their iconic melodies without any help. And as much as I wouldn't like to admit it, I can't say that Enchanted has that same spark. That's How You Know is a great song, but at best, it might scrape the top 50 Disney songs. As for the others, I doubt they'd even make the top 100. But, of all the criticisms with a medium, music is definitely one of the most subjective, so take this segment with a grain of salt. If you think every song in Enchanted is a 10 out of 10 banger that belongs in every workout playlist, more power to you. And while the later songs are only okay, I still think it's cool that the music changes with the tone of the film, as it evolves from fantasy to reality. Which brings us to the next point. In the words of a massive 10-year-old letdown, Enchanted is a fantasy based on reality. The premise of this movie is built on watching these two worlds coexist. And most of the time, Enchanted does a good job of weaving these two worlds together. The best examples of this are the early musical numbers, which blend Disney fantasy elements with the real-world setting. And we can see this with the film's main characters as well. Giselle is the Disney princess, and Robert is a normal guy, leading to a really fun dynamic throughout the film.
Take these flowers to Nancy, please.
What are you, crazy? They're birds. They don't know where she lives.
And in addition, Robert's daughter Morgan fits right in the middle, as a regular kid who still believes in a magical world. The character moments are some of the best parts in Enchanted, and it's in part to watching fantasy and reality come together in creative ways. But while Giselle, Robert, and Morgan are decent characters, the others are a bit of a mixed bag. Edward, Nathaniel, and Nerissa are intentionally written to be homages to characters in older movies, in all their cartoony and cheesy glory. And if you see Enchanted as a Disney fairy tale that just so happens to take place in our world, that's totally fine. It's not the most airtight excuse, but I can understand hand-waving certain aspects of the film as just a throwback or homage. That said, these characters are good examples of when fantasy isn't woven into reality very well. For the most part, Prince Edward is decent. Like Giselle, he's cartoonishly over the top, and it results in some great comedy when he arrives in New York.
I've been dreaming.
His antics do get a little stale as the movie goes on, but he's fine in small doses. And if there's any fairy tale trope to add, a cheesy prince makes a lot of sense for a comedy. Not to mention that he actually has a personality, which is more than you can say about the princes he's referencing. But Nathaniel and Nerissa don't really add that much to the story. They're mostly there to add a sense of danger to the film through attempted murder.
What is it?
It's apple martini, me. You want a juicy, sweet caramel apple, maybe?
Can I offer you a nice egg in this trying time?
Nathaniel has the benefit of at least being around for the whole movie. And while his shenanigans are a little hit and miss, he does have a neat character arc of his own by the end. But even though Nerissa is the main villain of Enchanted, she has next to no presence in the film past the prologue. Up until the third act, every other time she shows up, she basically just goes, "Nah, I'm evil," and teleports away. Nathaniel and Nerissa work as fairy tale homages, but Enchanted is a story that didn't really need a villain. Prince Edward already works as a good-natured antagonist, and the romance between Giselle and Robert works as the main conflict of the film. Enchanted was written as a love letter to Disney classics, and it shows, because the side effect was the inclusion of as many tropes, references, and homages as you could think of, whether they added to the story or not. I'm sure the initial pitch for this movie went something along the lines of, "So, what Disney films and tropes do you want to reference?"
Everything! Understood.
This isn't just my opinion either. You can hear from the director himself as he talks about the final act.
If you take the whole ending of the movie, it is really a conglomeration of everything that is Disney. You know, we tried to take every single element that exists in the climaxes of Disney movies and pull it together into this movie. And it was a huge undertaking.
And while it's tempting to include so many fairy tale tropes and homages, it doesn't mean you should. It's about picking and choosing the right elements that fit the story being told. The Happy Working Song number and the conversation at the Bella Notte restaurant are great examples of when Enchanted takes fantasy elements and weaves them into the story organically. But on the other hand, the plucky animal escapades, the evil schemes, and the dragon are examples of when the fantasy elements are smashed into reality without taking the time to make them fit the story naturally. The fairy tale throwbacks are fun, but they distract from the real story being told. It's hard to get invested in Giselle and Robert's relationship when all their important bonding moments are cut short by Disney shenanigans. Enchanted already does a decent job at using the right tropes or homages, and the movie would be even better if some of the more obtrusive elements were either cut or retooled in a way that fit the story. For example, a dragon fight is a staple in a fairy tale, but it has no place in a movie that takes place in our world. Enchanted's third act would be vastly better if the dragon was cut out, and the final act was just the king and queen's ball. If the intent was to create a modern-day fairy tale, it's hard to top a ballroom dance that concludes with true love's kiss. Or, it's implied in the prologue that Nerissa knows about the real world. You could cut Nathaniel out and rewrite Nerissa into a character who has a life in both Andalasia and New York City. It'd give her much more of a presence within the film, and even if she did still turn into a dragon at the end, at least she'd be a character we got to know a little more, instead of the bargain bin Maleficent we ended up getting. And while there's been a lot of focus on Enchanted's fantasy elements, there's some real-world aspects that don't fit either. Nancy Tremaine is Robert's long-term girlfriend, and like Nathaniel and Nerissa, she adds very little to the movie. She only exists to be a romantic obstacle between Giselle and Robert, which wasn't really necessary to begin with. These two are so fundamentally different from one another, and that's a very natural reason for why they don't get together until the end. I'd actually go as far as to say that Nancy's existence makes some parts of Enchanted worse. Despite what her surname will tell you, she seems like a really nice person. She has a completely justified outburst when Giselle stays the night at Robert's apartment.
Talk about what, Robert? How I never stay the night because we both agreed Morgan's here and you have to maintain some boundaries, and I thought I'm so lucky he's sensitive. I didn't realize you were worried about crowd control.
And after Giselle, not Robert, sends her flowers, she forgives Robert immediately. And later at the dance, she takes her breakup like a champ. If my significant other of 5 years fell in love with someone they met 2 days ago, I think I'd break down on the spot. Enchanted doesn't elaborate on Nancy and Robert's relationship in any meaningful way, so it makes Robert seem like kind of a terrible person. When taken at face value, he was about to propose to his long-term girlfriend, only to break up because of a literal chance encounter. At least Nancy gets a happy ending. She honestly deserved it. Imagine being the guy who leaves one Disney princess to go after the non-canon one. Like some of the fantasy elements, Nancy feels like such a superfluous addition to the film. If you cut Nancy out and keep Robert as a single father with emotional baggage from his divorce, very little changes. The most that would change is Prince Edward's ending, but I'm sure there's a girl in New York who's perfect for him.
It's Terry, the gender-neutral doll I had when I was a kid.
Enchanted is fairly good at balancing fantasy and reality, but when it's not, it creates this weird middle ground, where the fantasy overwhelms the reality, and the reality breaks the illusion of the fantasy. And we can see this in none other than the film's central conflict. Enchanted's romance is complicated. If you view the romance as a modern interpretation of a classic Silver Age Disney romance, it's fine. Classic Disney romances aren't exactly known for being nuanced tales of love and loss. But if you view Enchanted's romance from any other perspective, it's average at best. While Enchanted's romance is comparable to Silver Age romances, it doesn't hold a candle to most Disney romances past that. Disney isn't the gold standard for romance in the first place, but being on par with the weakest, most shallow Disney romances isn't a good look. And while you can handwave some parts of Enchanted for just being a fairy tale homage, that doesn't quite work here. While Enchanted is a fairy tale romance, it's also a modern romance. Parts of this love story work when viewed as a fairy tale, but not as a modern romance, and vice versa. For starters, while Giselle and Robert spend a majority of the film together, they don't get that much time dedicated to building their relationship. Robert spends the first half of the movie trying to get rid of Giselle, and Giselle spends the whole movie being in love with the idea of love until much later, when she comes to the shocking realization that Patrick Dempsey is handsome. The scene at Bella Notte is one of the only times where they seem to be enjoying each other's company, and it's super cute. This is actually one of my favorite moments in the entire movie.
You're a wizard.
The film could have used more scenes just like this before the final dance. You need scenes like the characters having fun with each other, talking or singing about their feelings, or being overwhelmed by their emotions. It adds depth to the relationship and makes it feel genuine. When you don't have enough scenes like this, it makes the relationship feel shallow and underdeveloped, which sadly is the case with Enchanted.
Please. Don't leave me.
Hello?
Okay, you know what? You gotta go.
And speaking of singing, of all the Disney tropes and references in this movie, I'm genuinely surprised that the ballroom sequence wasn't a duet between Giselle and Robert. Duets are not only some of the best songs in their respective musicals, but they serve as a culmination of the characters' feelings for each other. Robert makes it a point to establish that he doesn't sing or dance, and it would have been a really powerful moment for him to break out in song like Giselle does, and for her to return the favor. During the dance, there's even a transition where it looks as if something like that will happen, as the ballroom turns into an imaginary dream sequence. But the moment is over as quickly as it happens, not to mention other things getting in the way. Even if you ignore the dragon crashing the party, the ballroom sequence we actually get is a little underwhelming. So Close is a decent song, but it's sung by an outside character instead of the characters the song is about. As a result, it loses a lot of the impact the song could have had. And technically, Robert does sing, but at most, he mutters a single verse of the song to Giselle. There's a musical parody called Schmigadoon that honestly isn't even that good. But even Schmigadoon ended with the male lead starting a song, and the female lead joining in to finish it. That's a lot more than you could say about Enchanted, where the penultimate song is sung by some guy, and the male lead whispers into the female lead's ear. Even if their relationship remained underdeveloped, a final duet between Giselle and Robert would have done wonders to really sell this romance. At the very least, it would come close to capturing some fairy tale magic. But it doesn't. Enchanted works as a basic fairy tale romance, but that's it. Like a fairy tale love story, it's about as deep as a kiddie pool. And if Enchanted were just a fairy tale, you could excuse all this. There's nothing wrong with a good fairy tale romance. But Enchanted tries to have its cake and eat it too. It's a fairy tale romance that takes place in the real world, and it touches on real world relationship issues, like heartbreak, divorce, and loveless relationships. As much as I've clowned on Robert's questionable life decisions, he's still a single father dealing with emotional baggage from a broken marriage. He has valid reasons for not believing in true love and happily ever afters.
I don't want to set her up to believe in this dreams come true nonsense.
But dreams do come true. And maybe something wonderful will happen.
Yeah, well, I forgot who I was talking to.
But by the end of the film, none of that nuance is explored in any meaningful way. There's a real emotional barrier between Robert and Giselle, but they never have a moment where they can break down that barrier or meet somewhere in the middle. The ball is supposed to be the moment where that barrier is broken down and they finally see eye to eye. But a moment like this means nothing unless you actually put in the work to earn it. Giselle is right at the end. True love does exist, and all of your personal issues and heartbreak go away when you meet the right person. So, like with other parts of the film, Enchanted's romance finds itself in this weird middle ground. It's too shallow for a romance grounded in reality, but the real world issues and lack of magic prevent it from being a great fairy tale romance. At best, it's a good fairy tale romance. It's not amazing, but on the bright side, it's not terrible like your average superhero romance. Enchanted's romance is fine. Decent. A-okay. As a Disney fairy tale, musical, homage, and romance, Enchanted wears a lot of hats all at once. And at first glance, that's a good thing. It's what makes a movie like Enchanted have so much widespread appeal. But juggling so many genres like this is a double-edged sword. It's not impossible to handle so many moving parts, but it's not exactly easy either. The more you add to your workload, the less effort you can spend on improving something else. Basically,
never half-ass two things. Whole-ass one thing.
To really illustrate Ron's point, let's do a lightning round on how Enchanted handles its different genres. As a fairy tale, it's good. It hits all of the same notes you'd see in any classic story, for better and for worse. As a musical, it's good. It's not exceptional, but it could be a lot worse. As a parody and homage, it's good. There's references to the entire Disney catalog, as well as a few twists on classic cliches. It doesn't do anything too subversive, but it's fine for what it is.
Jeez, lady, are you for real?
And as a romance, it's fine. It's on par with any Silver Age romance, but weaker than every Disney romance beyond that, besides the obvious dumpster fires. So for Enchanted as a whole, it hits many of the same notes as its contemporaries, but doesn't excel in any particular area either. It's a pretty good Disney fairy tale, with pretty good music, and a good enough romance. And while the draw of a so-called Disney princess in our world is unique, you need a little more than that to stand out. Especially when Enchanted happens to be from the studio known for fairy tales, musicals, and romance. If there's anything that would have made Enchanted soar above its peers, it would be to lean into what sets it apart instead of just doing a pretty good job across the board. For example, while Enchanted does take place in the real world, there's no reason why it couldn't lean more into the magic and whimsy of a fairy tale. The French classic Amélie and the TV series Pushing Daisies are great examples of modern day fairy tales brought to life. From a visual standpoint, both Amélie and Pushing Daisies use bright color palettes, as well as unorthodox camera angles, to deliberately make the stories feel more surreal and fantastical. And in addition, both of them use an omniscient narrator to add that magical, storybook quality to their stories. You can see for yourself.
Dizzy with grief, curiosity, and hormones, young Ned and a girl named Chuck had their first and only kiss.
Enchanted has none other than Mary Poppins herself, Julie Andrews, as the narrator for the film's opening and ending. And I could easily see a version of Enchanted that uses her more to add a lighter, whimsical tone throughout the film. Or a version of Enchanted that had a more vibrant color palette or creative camera work, in order to make the film feel just a little more fantastical. And if Enchanted felt more fantastical, some of the film's weaker aspects, like the shallow romance or the dragon, don't stand out as much, because we expect to see those kind of things in a fairy tale. And since Enchanted is still a Disney musical, one or two more musical numbers would have done a lot to elevate the entire film, like the aforementioned duet with Giselle and Robert, or songs for the other characters. There were actually plans for Nerissa to get a villain song, and a final song featuring Idina Menzel and James Marsden that was cut from the final release. There's a lot of talent behind Enchanted's cast, and it's a bit of a missed opportunity to not get them songs to showcase that talent. Not only would some of these songs have fleshed out the weaker characters, but it'd go a long way to adding more Disney magic back into Enchanted. And while there's been a lot of emphasis on a more fantasy-focused Enchanted, I could see a version of the film that leaned a little more into reality. Enchanted was originally pitched as an R-rated adult comedy, and while that might have been a step too far, there is something to be said about adding the right themes to the film. I could see a version of Enchanted that took a more critical look at things like true love and happily ever afters, kind of like a modern romantic comedy. It'd be interesting to see a Disney film explore something like, say, a princess being in love with someone who doesn't feel the same way, or learning that there's more to life than romance. And then again, maybe that's a bit too much to ask from 2007 Disney. But in the end, I think the jack-of-all-trades approach of Enchanted is what really brings it down. Enchanted is a movie that borrows a lot from its predecessors, but doesn't do quite enough to step out of their shadow. It's a fairy tale that lacks the spectacle and grandeur of classic fairy tales, a parody that plays it too safe with its homages, and a romance that is too nuanced for a fairy tale, but too shallow for a modern love story. Enchanted has all the makings of a great movie, but it doesn't take advantage of what could make it great. It's just pretty good all around. But all that being said, none of this is enough to doom a movie to oblivion. There's one final thing we need to talk about.
Say, fellas, did somebody mention the door to darkness?
Of all the talking points, this is easily the simplest, and probably the most damning. Because Enchanted did well from both a critical and commercial standpoint, Disney planned to capitalize on its success with a sequel, which was slated for release as early as 2011. But the sequel ran into production issues for over a decade, with many writers and directors joining the project only to leave shortly after. Enchanted's sequel, Disenchanted, wouldn't really take off until 2020, with the film on track for a 2022 release date. And the sequel wasn't the only plan Disney had for the franchise. Like her predecessors, Giselle was planned to be crowned as an official Disney princess back in 2007. And unfortunately, this is where the animated, live-action hybrid of Enchanted's premise worked against it. Disney realized that in order to make Giselle an official Disney princess, they'd have to pay lifelong rights to use Amy Adams' image.
Fantastic.
So, those plans were scrapped, leaving Giselle as a Disney princess in everything but name. And while being excluded from the cool club kinda sucks, the bigger loss are all the perks Giselle would have had as an official princess, like an animated series, or Kingdom Hearts appearances. So as time passed, Enchanted was left as a Disney fairy tale that didn't get to enjoy the same privileges as other fairy tales. It didn't have the same cultural impact as the movies it paid homage to, and even if the movie was a perfect, genre-defining masterpiece, the lack of marketability might as well be a death sentence. It's just a good, but not great movie that got left behind over time. But, even though I spent a long time being more critical of this film, I still really like it. The modern fairy tale interpretations are charming. The comedy and meta humor hits more often than it misses, and all the actors do a phenomenal job. Especially Amy Adams, who kills it as a fairy tale princess brought to life. For all its imperfections, I find it hard to not be at least a little enchanted by Enchanted. All jokes aside, while I'm not that nostalgic for the movies Enchanted is based on, I've always been a little nostalgic for Enchanted itself. It's one of the first movies that made me realize musicals can be awesome, and it paved the way for me to experience some real movie magic. And while Enchanted doesn't always handle the fantasy elements well, I have a soft spot for modern interpretations of fairy tales. Some of my favorite stories of all time are, in many ways, modern fairy tales. So as someone who likes musicals and modern fairy tales, I don't think I could ever hate this film. It doesn't hold up quite as well as I thought it did, but it does still hold up. It's one of the more creative new franchises from Disney, and while it's far from perfect, there's 10 times more originality and heart in Enchanted than every single Disney remake to date. And it's definitely worth checking out, even over a decade later. It's a great film to watch with the whole family, and it's a fun one to revisit as an adult. And while I'm not exactly sold on the premise of Disenchanted, it's cool that Enchanted got a sequel in the first place. Fingers crossed that it's just as good as the original, and hopefully, it'll be even better.